Hi, thanks for joining me today to talk about tzedakah. Tzedakah is often wrongly translated as charity, and while it does involve giving, a more accurate translation of tzedakah would be that of righteousness or of justice. And that tells us a lot about the Jewish worldview when it comes to our possessions, what we have, and our obligations to others. Tzedakah, meaning righteousness or charity, means that the money that you have, or the wealth that you have, is not just yours to do whatever you want with, but rather Hashem has given it to you as a gift, and you have an obligation in terms of how it is distributed. And so when any of us give tzedakah, we're not just giving out of the generosity of our hearts, we're actually fulfilling a mitzvah and a commandment that is something that's required of all of us. The ideal in Judaism is that 10% of your income should be given to charitable causes or to those in need, tzedakah. And if you can, to increase till you're giving 20%. If you can give more than that, amazing. But the 10% is seen as kind of the minimal obligation for everybody. And I want to share with you a couple of stories that show just how much this applies to everybody. Some of you might know the famous educator Clive Lawton, who was a founder of the Limud movement. And one time he was in Jerusalem in the Old City, and as he was walking down to the Kotel, there was a man who was begging, and he came to ask him for tzedakah. And as he put up his cup, Clive said to him, "I don't have any money." And what Clive meant was he didn't have any cash on him. But the man whose English wasn't in his native language had misunderstood. And when he saw, his eyes widened and he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And he took money out of his cup that he'd been collecting and gave some coins to Clive, because he'd interpreted that as he didn't have money. And the man was aware that if Clive was less fortunate than he was, then he must give him tzedakah. He must give him, again, wrongly translated would be charity, but to give him some money. Beautiful, beautiful story. And the second one I heard that I really, really liked took place in Crown Heights in New York, where there was a woman before Shabbat also was collecting money, and she'd been standing on the street corner for a long time collecting, and she was tired and hungry, so she sat down to have a sandwich. And as she was eating her sandwich, another woman, unaware that that woman had been collecting, came to start asking people for money. And as she passed the woman with the sandwich, she took some of the money that she'd collected and gave a percentage of that to the woman who was collecting. So it really doesn't matter where we sit in terms of society and our wealth. All of us have opportunities to give, and all of us have an obligation to give as well. And today we're going to have a chance to look at how important tzedakah is, how valued it is in Judaism, and also the way in which we prioritize tzedakah and we are directed in terms of how we give. Because it's not just what we give, but also how we give that has a huge impact. And the Jewish views on that have highlighted just how much human dignity is a key Jewish value and is so important in terms of tzedakah. It's said that all should give tzedakah, and that doesn't necessarily mean money. It can mean money, but it also can mean things and services. To give tzedakah, again, going with this translation of righteousness or justice, is giving to people in need is the right thing to do, and there are multiple ways to do it. And there's a concept of having in the home a tzedakah box. Ours sits here by the Shabbos candles. Was a gift from my cousin, thank you, Sally, and is a beautiful reminder of what took place in the temple. So in temple times, there was actually a designated chamber called the Lishkat Chasha'in, and that roughly translates to the chamber of the discreet ones. And we'll come back to that, the chamber of the discreet ones, why that's important in terms of the way in which we give in Jewish culture. And that was a designated place where people could go and give, and then those other people who needed could receive, and they wouldn't be aware of each other. And it now is mirrored in our homes when we have a tzedakah box. Not only is it a fantastic example for our children that they can start to learn about giving, about generosity, about gratitude, because when you give, you also remember how blessed you are to have to give. But also, it's kind of making our homes a mini temple, because you're creating that discrete chamber, that designated area of giving in your own home as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about what the Shulchan Aruch, the Code for Jewish Law, says about priorities in terms of giving. Because practically Jewish philanthropy goes to all kinds of different sources. I'm proud to say, in terms of a sociocultural point of view, when we look at Jews, religious and secular, we are overrepresented in philanthropy, and that's regardless of our social status in the societies we're in. Jews give to Jewish causes, to non-Jewish causes, to national causes, to international causes. We're overrepresented in philanthropy, and I always get offended whenever that Jewish stereotype of being stingy comes up, because actually the research shows that the opposite is true. Jews are generous and give, and it's because it's such an ingrained part of our culture. And the Shulchan Aruch says when you're giving, from a Jewish perspective, family comes before non-family. It's not to say you shouldn't give to non-family, you absolutely should, but you should also prioritize your family. A local cause takes priority over a distant cause. And if you are giving to distant or international causes, then causes in the land of Israel take precedent over non-local charities. And even though we've got this kind of hierarchy of family, local, Israel, like I said, for most people, they're giving across these areas. So it's not that the others are missing out, but more that this is a bit of a guide to us about where our personal responsibilities lie. And what we do beyond that is fantastic. One interesting note, an amazing part of the connection between Israel and the diaspora, is that historically, money always went one way, right? For years and years and years, even before the establishment of the modern state of Israel, there were Jews around the world who were giving to causes for the Jews who were living in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. Before the creation of the state, hundreds of years, there's always been a Jewish presence in the land of Israel, and money has historically always been collected to go to the land of Israel. What we see in our times is the land of Israel reinvesting back in diaspora communities. And a huge example of this is through the Jewish Agency, and another example that they are in charge of is Taglit, Birthright. There's this amazing program where young people can go and experience Israel, young Jewish people can go and experience Israel, and it's a 3-part funded program. A third is funded by generous philanthropists that are based in the United States. A third is funded by a local community that is trying to send its young Jews to experience Israel. And a third is funded by the state of Israel, by the Jewish Agency. And this is an example of Israel reinvesting back into those Jewish communities, understanding that part of keeping Jews who aren't in Israel connected to their Judaism is actually now the responsibility of Medina Israel, of the state of Israel. So it's a very interesting and unique turn in history where we see the flow of tzedakah going in that opposite direction. Another guide for us in terms of how we give comes from the Rambam, the Maimonides. And Maimonides outlines 8 levels of giving, and each one decreasing a little bit in terms of value. All of them being important, all of them being valid, but almost thinking of them like a ladder that one could climb as they wanted to reach a higher spiritual level in the way in which they're giving. So let's start from the very top of the highest form of giving. And what I hope you'll see as we journey through these levels together is that the axis over here is one of human dignity, is one of really trying to protect the honor of the giver and the givee, the giver and the receiver, right? So when we consider why Judaism does this, we also tap into the Jewish values around avoiding embarrassment. that no one should feel ashamed or embarrassed, and that it is a huge issue in Judaism if we cause another human an embarrassment. And that's why we've got this focus on human dignity. So the absolute highest level of generosity is to give somebody a job, employment, or involve them in a business partnership so that they can have their own livelihood and earn their living in a dignified way. And it's kind of like the old adage of give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. Give somebody a handout, you help them temporarily, and it may cause them a little bit of embarrassment. Give somebody an employment opportunity and you give them the means to, in a dignified way, support themselves and, please God, their families as well. So that's the highest form of giving. The next layer down, number 2, the Rambam explains, is when there's anonymity between both parties. So the giver doesn't know where their generosity is going and the receiver doesn't know from whom it came. And that's why we have so many funds in Jewish communities where there's the opportunity to give and receive anonymously, because it's seen as such a powerful way to do tzedakah. The next level down, 3, is where the giver knows where their money's going, but it's anonymous to the receiver. And that again tells us something too. The fact that that is the direction we go next, that the giver knows that the receiver doesn't, reflects the fact that the Rambam understood that it can be more difficult for somebody to receive than it is to give. The 4th level is where the giver doesn't know where the money's going, but the recipient knows to whom they can express their gratitude. The 5th level down is a hand-to-hand, so both parties know and are involved in the interaction, but the generosity happens before anyone asks for it. Yeah, this is not an example of someone coming and saying, I need money. This is when the generosity happens where somebody gives and someone receives and there wasn't an ask involved. The 6th level down is if somebody asks and then somebody gives. So everybody knows who the giver and the receiver are. Yeah, both parties are aware. And the person in need has actually asked. And this, I suppose, is the typical example that we see, sadly, on the street when somebody's asking for tzedakah, right? They say, can you spare any change for Shabbat or something like that? And the recipient gives. That's level 6. Still incredibly holy, still super important. But as you can see from the interaction, the human dignity isn't as high as some of the other levels that we've seen before. Number 7, still a mitzvah, still really important, as if you give inadequately, but gladly and with a smile, right? So somebody is in need, you give a small amount that isn't enough and isn't what they had hoped for, but you do it wholeheartedly and with love. And the 8th level, the lowest level, which again, still a mitzvah, we're still obligated, still an important thing to do, is when you give unwillingly. And I love it that Judaism recognizes that even if you give bitterly and angrily and you don't want to give, there's still merit in it because it's good practice. And ultimately what we hope is that when we perform a mitzvah, even if we perform it without all of our hearts, it's great practice. It's that wonderful, like in psychology, the think, act, feel triangle. If you behave in a certain way, it starts to affect how you think about things and how you feel about things, and they're all interconnected. And Judaism recognizes that by doing the right thing, you will grow your way to feeling the right way about it ultimately as well. And so even to give with resentment is still a mitzvah in Judaism. You're still doing something that's worthwhile, meaningful, and part of this idea of righteousness and justice. So those are the Rambam's 8 levels. And again, you can see that message of human dignity. Other interesting messages that we have coming out of the Talmud about the significance of charity, not just for those who receive it, but for those who give it. And there's an adage that charity saves from death. And there are 2 stories that come up, interestingly, both involving snakes, that talk about this. One is the story of a reed cutter. This is in the Talmud, and he's saved from a snake because of the merit of the bread that he shared with a co-worker. And by sharing that bread, the decree that he was to be bitten by the snake is annulled, and he's saved from this incident. And the moral of the story is that charity can save from death. The other famous story is that of Rabbi Akiva's daughter. Rabbi Akiva is told by astrologers that his daughter will die in the bridal chamber from a snake bite. And he doesn't say anything to anyone, goes to the wedding, enjoys the festivities, and then is very surprised in the morning when his daughter runs in with a snake on her hairpin. And he says to her, "Tell me what happened." And she said, "Last night when I was taking down my hair after the wedding, it was dark in the room and I pushed my hairpin into the wall. I didn't know where to put it. And in the morning when I woke up, I saw that my hairpin had gone right through the eye of a snake that had been on the wall." And her father, Rabbi Akiva, says, "Was there anything that you did at the wedding, any mitzvah that you did, that could have merited you being saved in this way?" And she thought about it and she said, "Well, there was a very poor guest that came to the wedding, and when I saw him, I went and I offered him a seat and food and looked after him, and I did not eat at my own wedding feast until I knew that he had been taken care of." And Rabbi Akiva said, "Here we go, charity saves from death." So two beautiful stories where the connection between the mitzvah of generosity and of giving, tzedakah, righteousness, justice, can actually have consequences for us that we may not have anticipated or experienced. And tzedakah is quite an interesting and unique mitzvah in that way, because you have the ability with tzedakah to really bargain with Hashem, to demand things of Hashem. There are beautiful traditions like before we light the Shabbos candles, that we give some tzedakah and we ask for what we need and we want for those that we care about, for ourselves. It's like a mitzvah with a bit of chutzpah, with a bit of Jewish cheekiness, because it does give us access to Hashem in a different way, that we can pray in a different way as well. And some people say, though, well, should we really be giving tzedakah? Should we be interfering with Hashem's ways? If, doesn't Hashem want the poor to be poor, or he'd have made them rich? Why do I need to give? And the Talmud points to an interesting incident that happened, again, between Rabbi Akiva and Turnus Rufus, the wicked, he's called. Gives you a clue already who the goodie and the baddie is in the story. And Turnus Rufus is kind of making this point. Why are you Jews giving with generosity? Yeah? If poor people are poor, that's their problem, and it's decreed by your God. Why are you interfering? And he gives the example of a parable. He said, imagine the king has a slave, and the slave is thrown into prison, and the king tells everyone to leave the slave alone, and then finds out that one of the guards has been giving the slave extra special treatment, extra food, extra privileges. The king would be furious. And Rabbi Akiva says, look, let me answer with another analogy. He said, maybe so with the slave, but in this case, imagine the king has a son. And the son he loves has done something terrible, and he has to put him in prison. And it breaks his heart that once he's in prison, there's a guard who sneaks him extra food and who cares for him even though he's in prison. When the king finds out what that guard's done, he's just happy and grateful that somebody is looking out for his son. And in that way, Rabbi Akiva explained that from Hashem's point of view, we're all Hashem's children. And so when one of us helps another one, even if that person is suffering because it is a decree from heaven, Hashem wants us to help each other. It's not interfering with his plan at all if we are generous towards those in need. Quite to the contrary, Hashem's grateful and proud that we are contributing in the way that we are. And who knows if not for that reason that we've merited to have that bit of wealth ourselves. That part of our parnasa, our livelihood, was given to us in order that we could help somebody else. And by thinking about it in this way, it also helps us to keep humble too. Because when we're giving, it's not that we're so generous and we're so wonderful, but rather we've been given the privilege to redistribute the resources in this world to where they need to be going. And that's also a really significant and central concept in terms of Jewish values and Jewish thought. I just want to finish up by talking a little bit about Rabbi Meir Baal Hanes, who's often connected with tzedakah. Interesting story, I came across Rabbi Meir Baal Hanes when my mum lost her wallet And well, we didn't know where it was lost. And I've got this beautiful book that my lovely husband gave me called Anani, and it's got prayers for different occasions, and one of the prayers is a prayer for finding a lost object. And there's this amazing prayer which you say, you give tzedakah, charity, and you say, God of Rabbi Meir, answer me. And you're calling on the merit of Rabbi Meir Balanes to ask Hashem to help you find it. In Judaism, we're never praying to an intermediary or even through an intermediary, but we do draw on the merit of those we're associated with. We see that in the Amidah, where we open with describing God as God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, connecting to our heritage to kind of just be like, hey Hashem, don't forget me. I come from good stock, or I'm associated with these good people that you already love and know. And so it's the same with Rabbi Meir Balanes. He's associated with tzedakah. And so we can draw on that when we give tzedakah and we need something in return, we can draw on Rabbi Meir Balhanes, Hashem, God of Rabbi Meir Balhanes, answer me. So I wish you all many opportunities for generosity and giving.